I want to try a little experiment to kick things off today. I want you to mentally open, say, 3 browser tabs in your mind. Just picture them.
Okay.
In that first tab, you've got the drudgery of the Middle East news cycle. You know, U.S. destroyers in the Persian Gulf, Iranian centrifuges spinning, all the usual tension we've lived with for decades.
Right, the forever tension. It's almost become background noise for a lot of people at this point.
It really has. Okay, now, tab 2. Shift your focus. I want you to picture a map of South America. Specifically, zoom in on that thick, humid, really dense jungle border between Venezuela and Guyana. You've got troops massing, there's talk of massive oil reserves, and it almost feels like 19th century imperialism is making a comeback.
Which feels like a completely different genre of news. That's a history lesson, not a headline.
Right, exactly. And then tab 3. For this one, I want you to picture a local news report. It's from Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Okay, Minneapolis.
It's that gritty, handheld camera footage.
Yeah.
You see immigration officers in full tactical gear. They're making arrests in, of all places, a Target parking lot. You have protesters blowing whistles. There are local police just sort of standing by but not helping. It just feels chaotic.
So let me get this straight. We have the Middle East, the Amazon jungle, and a parking lot in the Midwest.
On the surface, these are 3 random, completely isolated stories. You'd scroll right past them on your phone without making a single connection. But what if I told you that is the absolute wrong way to read the news? What if I told you that those aren't 3 separate stories, but actually 3 chapters in the exact same book?
And I'm guessing that book is titled Invisible Wars.
That is the hook for today. We are doing a deep dive into a really fascinating, and I have to say, frankly, a kind of terrifying set of documents.
Terrifying is a good word for it.
We are looking at a situation report from the President's Daily Brief,
Yeah.
you know, the PDB, and it's dated just recently, February 2026.
Which puts us right in the thick of a very specific and very plausible future timeline. And the document itself is unique because of how it synthesizes 2 very different types of intelligence.
Yeah, talk about the sources here, because we aren't just reading a generic news recap, are we?
Not at all. On one side, you have the geopolitical analysis from a guy named Joshua Phillip. He's a senior investigative reporter. His main beat is asymmetric warfare.
Asymmetric, so unconventional warfare.
Exactly. He looks at what the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, is doing in the shadows. He lives in that gray zone of conflict, you know, the places where there are no missiles flying, but it is absolutely a war.
Okay, so he's the global strategy guy. And then on the domestic side?
On the domestic side, we have Art Arthur. He's a former INS official, now with the Center for Immigration Studies. This is a guy who understands the, let's call it the plumbing of the U.S. immigration system better than just about anyone.
The plumbing. I like that.
He knows the statutes, he knows all the loopholes, and crucially, he knows the operational reality for the officers on the ground.
So we have the global strategist and the policy mechanic. And our mission today is to do something that I admit sounds a bit like a conspiracy theory until you actually see the wiring.
Go on.
We are going to connect the dots between the Chinese Communist Party's grand strategy for global dominance and the arrest of a petty shoplifter in a Minneapolis parking lot.
It's a bold claim, but when you look at the mechanics, like you said, the connections start to look less like a conspiracy board with red string and more like a circuit board. It's just how the power flows.
Let's start with that phrase then, invisible war. Because usually when we think of war, we think of tanks crossing borders. We think of kinetic action, you know, things blowing up.
Of course, that's the 20th century model of war. But the source material here, especially from Phillip, argues that we're living in a period where nothing happens in a bubble. The conflict is continuous, but it's economic, it's diplomatic, it's subversive.
It's about finding pressure points.
Exactly. And to understand the map of those pressure points, we have to start with a concept the report calls the 3 pillars.
This really struck me. The report opens with U.S. pressure on Iran. Now, normally, if I see a headline that says U.S. sanctions Iran or U.S. squeezes Tehran, my mind immediately goes to Israel.
Or nuclear proliferation.
Or nuclear proliferation.
Right.
That's the box we put it in.
That's the standard frame, and it has been for 40 years. We view Iran as a Middle Eastern problem to be managed. But Joshua Phillip argues that this is just too small a lens. He says if you want to understand why the U.S. is pressuring Tehran in this 2026 context, you have to look east. You have to look at Beijing.
So Iran is just a pawn in the U.S.-China game, a proxy.
It's more than a proxy. The report describes it as a pillar. Philip lays out the CCP's global power structure as resting on three main legs.
Okay.
You have Russia, you have China itself, and you have Iran.
Okay, I get Russia and China. I mean, they're the heavyweights. But why is Iran elevated to that same level? Is it just ideology? Is it just that they both dislike the West?
The source says it's almost entirely transactional. I mean, think about it from China's perspective. What do they need more than anything to survive a prolonged conflict with the West? Their economy is massive, but it's incredibly vulnerable.
They needed resources. They need energy.
They need energy security. That's where Iranian oil comes in, heavily discounted, by the way. If the Strait of Malacca gets blockaded in a conflict over Taiwan, China dies on the vine. They need a pipeline of energy that the U.S. Navy can't just turn off like a spigot.
So Iran is their strategic gas station.
It's a gas station, but it's also, and this is key, a chaotic agent. China's strategy relies on distraction. They need chaos bubbling up elsewhere in the world to keep the U.S. occupied.
And nobody does regional chaos quite like Tehran.
Nobody. They provide that regional leverage. They are the anchor of what the report calls an emerging authoritarian bloc.
So the logic follows then.
Yeah.
If you squeeze Iran, you aren't just hurting the mullahs in Tehran.
You're pinching China's fuel line.
You're making their life much, much more difficult.
Exactly. It's a geopolitical bank shot. If you can destabilize Iran or just cut off their ability to export oil and fund their proxies, you fracture China's strategic partnership. You damage the CCP's global influence without ever having to fire a shot at a Chinese ship.
It's a way of fighting China indirectly.
It is. And this leads us to what is, for me, the most chilling part of the geopolitical section, a concept called the four-war strategy.
And this wasn't just some pundit riffing, right? This comes from a very specific source inside the CCP.
A very specific source, a man named Qin Conrang, who was an advisor to Xi Jinping. And what's absolutely critical here is the timing. This analysis isn't a reaction to what's happening now.
Oh, this is old.
It predates the war in Ukraine. It predates the October 7th attacks in Israel. This was a forward-looking roadmap. It was their blueprint for victory.
And what was the destination on that map? What was the ultimate goal?
Taiwan. I mean, it's always Taiwan. But Qin Conrang's core argument was that China cannot, under any circumstances, take Taiwan as long as the United States is focused, rested, and ready.
Because if the entire U.S. 7th Fleet is sitting there waiting for you, an amphibious invasion is basically suicide.
It's a non-starter. So the strategy is you have to fracture the American attention span. You have to divide its military power. The strategy explicitly calls for the U.S. to be actively engaged in 4 separate resource-draining conflicts simultaneously.
Engage. That's a very polite word for bogged down.
Bogged down. Bleeding resources, bleeding political will, divided attention at home, all of it.
Let's list the 4 fronts. Because when you see them laid out like this, it looks suspiciously like the headlines we've all been reading for the last few years.
It's uncanny. Front 1, a war with Russia.
Check. I mean, the war in Ukraine has consumed a massive amount of U.S. and NATO ordnance, money, and diplomatic bandwidth.
An incredible amount. Front 2, a war with a major terrorist organization, effectively puppeteered by Iran.
The Middle East. Check. We've seen carrier strike groups parked there for months on end. It's a constant drain.
Front 3, a war in Latin America.
That's the one. That's the one we're going to unpack in a second because it feels the most surprising, the most out of left field. And front 4.
The main event, the Pacific, the war over Taiwan.
It's the old firefighter analogy, right? If I'm going to rob your house, I don't just kick in the front door.
No.
I light fires in 3 other corners of your house first. While you're running around with a bucket of water, you're too busy to notice me breaking into the safe in the 4th room.
That is a perfect analogy. And the source, this PDB, implies that the current U.S. administration, in this 2026 timeline, they saw this setup. They saw the whole board. They realized that if they allowed all 3 of those preliminary fires to burn at once, the game was over. Taiwan would be lost.
So they made a move to preempt one of them. To checkmate that 3rd front.
The Latin American front. And this is the part of the story that I think flew under the radar for so many people because Europe and the Middle East are just so loud, they suck up all the oxygen.
Right.
But we came perilously close to a major, major war in our own hemisphere.
We did. And it's centered on a country that, let's be honest, most Americans probably couldn't find on a map. Guyana.
Right. A small nation just north of Brazil, east of Venezuela, mostly jungle, a bit of coastline. Not exactly a global superpower.
Until they found the oil.
Until they found the oil. And we're not talking about a small discovery. We're talking massive, world-class offshore deposits. The kind of find that can change a nation's destiny overnight.
And naturally, where there's that much oil, U.S. companies are
Of
there.
course, ExxonMobil is there, Chevron is there. It's huge U.S. commercial interest. But over in Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro looks at that map, sees those oil platforms going up and says, wait a minute, that territory, we used to claim that territory 100 years ago. It's ours.
It's the I drink your milkshake scene from There Will Be Blood.
It's exactly that. He revived this century-old, long-dormant territorial claim. International courts looked at it and said, no, absolutely not. That border is settled. It belongs to Guyana.
But dictators don't always listen to judges, do they? Especially when they're broke and need a patriotic distraction.
Exactly. And the PDB details some really scary movements here. This wasn't just, rhetoric on Twitter or speeches at the UN.
It was real.
This was kinetic. They moved the Venezuelan Navy into position. They amassed troops on the border. The source says they were literally cutting new trails through the jungle for tanks and armored vehicles.
Wow.
They were conducting live-fire war games within shooting distance of U.S.-operated oil assets. This was not a bluff.
And Brazil was involved, too.
Yeah.
That's the detail that really widens the scope for me. That takes it from a regional squabble to something much bigger.
That's the force multiplier. The source alleges that Brazil, under President Lula, was reportedly ready to back Venezuela's invasion.
So if that happens, you're not just dealing with a single rogue state.
No, you're dealing with a continental war, a bloc of nations acting in concert against a U.S.-backed ally.
Okay, so play that out for a second. Let's say the invasion happens. Venezuela rolls into Guyana. What does that do to the United States?
It's a complete nightmare scenario on multiple levels. First, global energy prices go through the roof because a major new supply is immediately threatened. That hurts every American at the pump.
Okay, economic chaos.
Second, you have an immediate humanitarian catastrophe. An invasion would send millions of refugees fleeing north. And where do they go? They head for the U.S. border, creating an unmanageable crisis.
And third,
the U.S. almost certainly has to intervene militarily. You have to protect your commercial assets. You have to protect your allies. You can't let a dictator redraw the map with force in your own backyard.
boom. Front number 3 is active. The U.S. military is now bogged down in the Amazon jungle, fighting a land war in South America.
It fulfills the Chinese strategic requirement perfectly. It pulls American carriers, troops, and most importantly, attention away from the Pacific.
So why didn't it happen? Why aren't we reading about the Battle of Georgetown right now? What stopped it?
The source credits a very specific, very aggressive, and very quiet intervention. It says Marco Rubio, who in this timeline is acting as Secretary of State, went to the region. And the message delivered wasn't a polite diplomatic note.
What was the message?
The message, according to the PDB, was effectively, if you do this, the Maduro regime ends, period. And they backed it up.
Oh.
They started squeezing the money. They went after the illicit assets of the regime's leaders. They started intercepting drug boats, which is a major source of their off-the-books cash. They made it clear that the pain of an invasion would be personal and immediate for the people in charge.
So this checkmate, as the source calls it, this rapid escalation of non-military pressure, prevented the invasion and kept that third front from opening.
That's the argument presented in the brief, yes.
It's just amazing to think about how fragile that piece is. But you mentioned the drug trade there as a pressure point, and this segues perfectly into something else the report calls the pink wave. It sounds harmless, almost like a fashion trend, but the definition here is pretty specific and pretty dark.
Yeah, it's not a pop culture moment. The pink wave is the term used to describe the systematic takeover of Latin American governments by socialist and communist parties. It really started accelerating in the early 2000s and just continued right through the 2020s.
And the source is clear.
Yeah.
This wasn't just organic voting. It wasn't just millions of people waking up one day and saying, hey, let's try socialism.
No, they point the finger directly at Cuba. We tend to think of Cuba as this, isolated island with old cars and cigars trapped in the 1950s.
Right, a failed state.
But the report describes Havana as an intelligence superpower in the region.
Trained by the best.
Trained by the KGB. The Soviet legacy lives on in their intelligence services, the G2. And the claim in this document is that Cuban agents systematically infiltrated the militaries, the intelligence agencies, and the political parties of Venezuela, Brazil, and other nations to facilitate this political shift.
And once they had these governments aligned, they formed a club. The source mentioned something called the Foro de São Paulo.
It's much more than a club. It's a strategic alliance. And this is the really wild part. You have legitimate governments, presidents, foreign ministers sitting at the same table with narco-terrorist groups like FARC from Colombia.
That is a hell of a seating chart. Mr. President, on your right is the guy who runs the hemisphere's cocaine trafficking.
And their stated goal, their mission, is explicit. Push the gringos, the United States, out of the region. Create a unified bloc that is hostile to Washington and wide open for business with Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran.
They want to create a keep-out sign for the U.S. in its own hemisphere.
And this brings us right to the heart of asymmetric warfare, because if you're Venezuela, you can't beat the U.S. military in a head-to-head fight. It's not possible.
No.
So you don't fight them head-to-head, you rot them from the inside. And the most effective rotting agent the world has ever known is drugs.
This section of the report requires a complete reframing of how we think about the drug trade. This was the big aha moment of the entire deep dive for me.
For me, too.
I think the average listener, they think Breaking Bad or Narcos, they think it's about greed. Criminals want to get rich, so they sell drugs. End of story.
That is the criminal lens. That's how the FBI or the DEA views it, and that's their job. But the source argues we have to take off the law enforcement hat and put on the warfare hat.
Right.
For state actors like China, the money is secondary. The profit is a bonus. The drug itself is the weapon.
Weaponized corruption, that's the phrase they use.
Exactly. Think about the mechanics. If you want to destabilize a rival nation, you can invade them. That's expensive, it's messy, it gets you a lot of bad press. Or you can flood their country with highly addictive substances like fentanyl.
Which kills your workforce, drains your healthcare system, and tears apart your social fabric.
Right. That's the societal damage. But even more important strategically is what the proceeds of that drug trade do. That black market, with billions and billions of dollars in cash, that money corrupts institutions.
You can buy the mayor.
You can buy the mayor. You can buy the police chief. You can buy the judge. You can buy the general. You hollow out the state from the inside until it's just a shell.
So the government becomes a zombie. It looks like a government. It has a flag and a parliament and an army, but it's actually controlled by the cartels.
And who is at the top of that supply chain? Who is the wholesaler for this entire enterprise?
The PDB lays out a global supply chain. It's very clear.
It is. The CCP, according to the source, supplies the precursor chemicals, all the raw ingredients you need to make fentanyl. They provide the sophisticated money laundering services through their state-controlled banks, washing all that dirty cash so it looks clean. They run the ports in places like Manzanillo where the chemicals land.
And the cartels in Mexico.
They are just the logistics department. They're the muscle. They're the last-mile delivery service for a geopolitical attack orchestrated from Beijing.
That is a terrifying thought.
Yeah.
It means the overdose crisis that you see in Ohio or Kentucky or West Virginia isn't just a public health failure.
Yeah.
It's a casualty count in a war we didn't even know we were fighting.
That is exactly the argument that Joshua Phillip makes in this report. And the cartels aren't the only ones using that sophisticated delivery network. This is where we hit what the report calls the terror nexus.
The report mentions Hezbollah operating in Tijuana.
I know. It sounds completely jarring. We associate Hezbollah with Lebanon, with the fight against Israel, with Syria. But the source claims Hezbollah has established training camps right on the U.S.-Mexico border.
What are they teaching? Are they trying to convert cartel members to radical Islam?
No, it's not ideological at all. It's purely technical. It's a knowledge transfer. Hezbollah has spent decades fighting a highly sophisticated asymmetric war against one of the world's best militaries. They are masters of the tunnel.
Tunnels.
Think about the incredibly complex tunnel networks under Gaza or in southern Lebanon. We're talking reinforced concrete, ventilation, electricity, communications. The source claims Hezbollah is teaching the cartels how to build those on an industrial scale under the U.S. border.
And it's not just digging.
Oh, no. It's IEDs, improvised explosive devices. They're teaching them advanced bomb-making skills. And more recently, drone warfare.
Like we're seeing in Ukraine.
Exactly like we're seeing in Ukraine. The source mentions handheld drone bombs, the kind you can fly into a police vehicle or a military checkpoint. We are seeing Mexican cartels use tactics that look exactly like modern warfare in the Middle East.
Because they're being trained by seasoned soldiers.
By experts. And the implication for the U.S. border isn't just that drugs are coming through these new super tunnels.
It's that anything can come through.
Anything and anyone. The source explicitly mentions intelligence reports of Middle Eastern men in camouflage being escorted across the border by cartel guides.
Yeah.
If you can pay the toll, you can use the tunnel. And if you have a tunnel that can move a ton of cocaine undetected, you have a tunnel that can move a squad of special operatives undetected.
It connects right back to that Maoist strategy that Joshua Phillip talked about. What was it? Surround the cities with the countryside.
It's a classic revolutionary tactic, right? You don't launch a frontal assault on the heavily defended fortress. You take over all the villages surrounding it first. You cut off the supply lines. You isolate it. You bleed it dry.
And in this global context, the United States is the city.
And Latin America is the countryside. And if you can compromise that countryside, if you can fill it with hostile regimes, weaponized corruption, and terror cells, you have effectively surrounded the fortress. You can strangle it without ever laying a glove on it.
So we've looked at the grand strategy from Beijing. We've looked at the regional rot in Latin America. We've seen the supply chain of drugs and terror. Now we have to look at where this all lands. Section 4 of the PDB brings us from the jungles of Guyana to the streets of Minneapolis.
From the jungle to the Target parking lot.
This transition is jarring, but it's where the rubber meets the road. We are talking about something called Operation Metro Surge.
This was a massive law enforcement operation. The numbers are pretty staggering. Over 4,000 arrests of undocumented immigrants in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area alone.
4,000. That is a huge number for just one city. But the report and the analysis from Art Arthur isn't just patting ICE on the back. It's highlighting a massive internal conflict within the administration about how to enforce the law.
It's the battle between broad enforcement and targeted enforcement. And the key figure here, according to the document, is Tom Homan, who is described as the border czar in this timeline.
Homan is a big advocate for the targeted approach. Walk us through his logic. Why does he prefer one way over the other?
It's actually very pragmatic. It's not about politics for him. It's about officer safety and community safety. Homan's argument is that the safest, most efficient, and best place to arrest a criminal alien is inside a jail or a prison.
Because they're already in handcuffs.
Exactly. They've already been arrested by local police for a crime, a DUI, an assault, domestic violence, whatever. They are in a secure, controlled facility. They have been searched for weapons. You just send 2 agents to the booking room. They do the paperwork. They transfer custody, and they deport the person. No drama, no chase, no public scene.
Okay, that sounds like the most logical, common sense way to do it. So why isn't that happening?
2 words. Sanctuary city.
We hear this term constantly. But let's strip away the politics for a second and just look at the mechanics. What does a sanctuary policy actually do in this scenario? What is the practical effect?
It breaks that logical chain of custody. In a place like Minneapolis or Chicago or New York or anywhere in California, the local sheriff's department is forbidden by local law or policy from cooperating with ICE. They will not honor an IC detainer.
So IC sends a formal request, a legal document, saying, please hold John Doe for us. He's a deportable alien with a criminal record. And the local jail just says,
no, they ignore it. And when that individual's local charges are processed, or if he makes bail, they open the back door and he walks out into the street.
So now the guy's back in the community.
And ICE still has a federal mandate, a court order, to arrest him. That order didn't just vanish because the local jail ignored it. But now they don't know exactly where he is. They have to go hunting for him.
And this is what leads to the raids. The big visible sweeps.
This creates what Arthur calls the sanctuary paradox. The policy is supposedly intended to shield the immigrant community from federal enforcement. But because it forces IC to release their targets back into that same community, it forces them to send heavily armed teams into those neighborhoods to find them.
The report specifically mentions Target parking lots and Home Depots.
Those are what they call at-large arrests. And just think about the resources required. To do a pickup in a jail, you need maybe 2 agents in a vehicle, an hour of work.
Okay.
To do an at-large arrest on the street. The source says you need a team of at least 10 officers.
Why 10? That seems excessive.
Because you have no idea what you're walking into. You need a perimeter. You need people watching for threats from every direction. You need to control the crowd. You need 2 officers to make the actual arrest and 8 more just to protect those 2. It's a dangerous, uncontrolled environment.
And it's highly visible. It creates a scene. People pull out their phones and start filming. It looks like a military sweep of a neighborhood.
Which the source argues is exactly what the local politicians want. It accuses officials like Governor Walz and Mayor Frey of deliberately creating a situation where these raids become public spectacles.
It mentions constitutional observer groups showing up.
Right. Activist groups that show up to blow whistles, film the agents, get in their faces, and generally disrupt the entire operation. The source argues that local officials encourage this to create political friction and generate negative headlines for the federal government.
So it's a feedback loop. The sanctuary policy creates the need for the raid. The raid creates public outrage, and that outrage is then used to justify the sanctuary policy.
And in the meantime, the operational efficiency drops to almost zero. You are spending 10 times the money and 10 times the manpower to arrest the exact same guy you could have picked up safely in the booking room for the cost of a fax.
Let's look at the numbers, though, because there's a narrative war happening alongside this invisible war. Section 5 of the report really gets into the weeds on the data of who is actually being arrested.
And the scale of the problem is just staggering. The report cites an internal DHS backlog of 2.9 million people who have been paroled into the country and another 5 million who were released under the previous administration with notices to appear in court.
That's a population larger than most U.S. states.
Yeah.
But ICE isn't trying to deport 8 million people at once, right? That's logistically impossible.
No, not at all. They are focusing on a very specific, much smaller subset, the people with final removal orders.
Define that term. Because the legal language really matters here.
A final removal order means you have had your day in court, you've had full due process. You went before an immigration judge, you presented your case for asylum or residency, and the judge heard it, rejected it, and issued a legal order for you to leave the country. You've exhausted all your appeals.
So legally speaking, the debate is over. You are under a court order to go.
That's right. And there are 1.6 million people in the U.S. who fall into that specific bucket. But here is the kicker, and this is the really important number. Of those 1.6 million, the source says 800,000 of them, fully half, also have criminal records in the United States.
So we're talking about nearly 1 million people who have been told by a judge to leave the country and have committed crimes while being here illegally.
That is the priority target list. But then you see the media pushback. The report cites a specific CBS News segment that was getting a lot of attention, claiming that only 14% of the recent arrests were of violent criminals.
Only 14%.
That phrasing does a lot of heavy lifting, doesn't it? It's designed to make it sound like IC is just rounding up grandmothers and people who didn't mow their lawn.
And that's where Art Arthur, the policy mechanic, steps in to completely dismantle that statistic. First, he points to a law called the Laken-Riley Act.
This is a piece of federal legislation named after the nursing student in Georgia who was murdered by an undocumented immigrant.
Yes, and that law is very specific. It legally requires IC to prioritize the arrest of nonviolent criminals. Specifically, it targets shoplifters, thieves, and people who commit larceny. Wait, it requires them to go after nonviolent offenders. That sounds counterintuitive. If you have limited resources, why not just focus on the murderers and rapists?
It's the broken windows theory of policing applied to immigration. The idea is that violent criminals rarely start their criminal careers with murder. They start with smaller crimes, they start with theft, they start with assault. The individual who murdered Laken-Riley had been arrested for shoplifting and other nonviolent offenses prior to the murder.
So the argument is, if he had been arrested and deported for the nonviolent crime of shoplifting, the violent crime of murder would never have happened.
That's the entire logic behind the law. Arthur argues that waiting for someone to become violent before you deport them is just waiting until there's an American victim. So when the news says ICE is arresting nonviolent shoplifters, ICE's response is yes. That is the law, and that is how we prevent future violence.
There's also a data skew that's created by the sanctuary issue itself, right? The numbers get distorted.
That's a really crucial point he makes. If ICE is physically blocked from getting into the state prisons and county jails to arrest the convicted murderers and rapists because the sanctuary state won't let them in the door, then their arrest statistics will naturally skew toward the people they can find.
Who are often the lower-level offenders that they have to hunt for out on the street.
Exactly. If you lock the door to where all the big fish are, ICE has no choice but to fish in the pond of the general community. So the statistics don't reflect ICE's priorities. They reflect their lack of access.
One thing I want to touch on before we wrap up is the technology behind all this. Because listening to this, you might get the impression that ICE is just driving around neighborhoods randomly looking for people who look illegal.
Which is the common perception, but according to Arthur, it's completely wrong. It's an incredibly high-tech operation.
So how do they find one specific shoplifter in a city of millions? It's not like they're going door to door.
No. It all comes from a place called the LESC, the Law Enforcement Support Center in Vermont.
Is this some kind of massive database?
It's more of an interoperability hub. Think of it as a massive biometric switchboard for all of U.S. law enforcement. When a local cop in Minneapolis arrests someone for, say, shoplifting at that target, they take the person's fingerprints. That's standard procedure for any booking anywhere in the country.
Okay.
In the old days, those prints would just go to the FBI's criminal database. But now, thanks to this interoperability system, they also automatically ping the Department of Homeland Security's database instantly, in real time.
So a computer in Vermont gets an alert that says, hey, the guy who was just booked for shoplifting in Minneapolis is on the final removal order list, and he has a prior felony.
Within minutes. The system knows exactly who he is and exactly where he is. The invisible war on the domestic front isn't about a lack of information. It's about a clash of jurisdiction and political will. The feds know precisely where the target is. The locals just won't let them have him.
It really brings it all full circle. We started with a grand strategy cooked up in Beijing to distract the United States with global fires. We moved through the pink wave in Latin America, creating a hostile neighborhood on our doorstep. We saw how the drug trade is being weaponized to hollow out institutions and kill our citizens. And we ended up at a parking lot in Minnesota, seeing how those immense global pressures cause our own local systems to break down and turn against each other.
It's one interconnected ecosystem. You cannot separate foreign policy from domestic policy anymore. The lines are gone.
If you leave the back door open in the jungles of Guyana, you eventually find mud in your living room in Minneapolis.
That's a very good way to put it. The strings are all connected.
Before we sign off, I want to leave you, our listener, with one final, slightly disturbing thought that was buried deep in the source material. We touched on it with the drug trade, but it goes much deeper.
The economy of crime.
Yes. Joshua Phillip made this point that for some nations, North Korea is the classic example, but also parts of this emerging Latin American bloc crime isn't a bug in their system, it's the entire feature.
It's their GDP. We're talking about state-sponsored counterfeiting of U.S. currency, state-sponsored hacking and ransomware, and state-sponsored drug trafficking. The state itself is a criminal enterprise.
So here's the question to mull over. If you are dealing with a nation or a block of nations where crime is the fundamental engine of their economy, can you ever really solve that with police?
It raises a fundamental question, doesn't it? At what point does this cease to be a law enforcement issue entirely? If the fentanyl trade is a state-backed military strategy designed to weaken your country, then sending a DEA agent to stop it is like bringing a knife to a missile fight.
It suggests we might need to totally rethink what we call war and what we call crime. The lines are not just blurred. For these actors, they may not exist at all.
They are completely gone.
Something to chew on. Next time you see a headline, don't just read it. Look for the invisible string connecting it to the rest of the world. Thanks for diving in with us.
Stay curious.